Ever heard someone say, you can run Proxmox on a potato?
Yeah, it's a catchy phrase, isn't it?
It does kind of make you think, right? Like, how low can you go? Could my 10-year-old laptop really become a home server?
Well, that's the appeal of Proxmox, I guess. It's so lightweight. But there's a difference between running it and actually having a, good experience.
Exactly. We're going deep today on finding the right used hardware for Proxmox. Not breaking the bank, but also not pulling your hair out because it's just too slow.
Right, right. And our sources for this deep dive really emphasize that balance. It's about being smart in the used market.
So not just grabbing the oldest thing you can find.
Exactly.
So let's talk about that potato idea. One of our sources actually tried this, setting up Proxmox on a really old ThinkCentre.
Oh, wow, like really old.
Yeah, pretty old. And, it booted, which on the surface, you might think, hey, success.
Yeah, that's a good first step, I guess.
But here's the thing. Just because something is old doesn't automatically make it a good virtualization candidate.
Right, right. What was the issue with the ThinkCentre?
It didn't have virtualization support on the CPU. No Intel VTX or AMD-V.
Ah, yeah. That's kind of essential, isn't it?
It's absolutely crucial. Those CPU features are what allow your computer to basically pretend to be multiple computers at once. That's the magic of virtualization.
Like it creates those virtual environments where each VM thinks it has its own dedicated hardware.
Exactly. Without those CPU extensions, Proxmox is basically running in slow motion, and you miss out on, tons of features.
So, lesson learned, age alone isn't enough. You need that virtualization support built into the CPU.
Absolutely. It's the first thing to check when you're looking at used hardware.
Okay, so CPU virtualization, what else should people be looking for? What are the non-negotiables for a decent Proxmox setup?
Well, after the CPU, it's all about RAM. And I mean, a good amount of RAM.
Yeah, RAM is pretty important for any computer, but especially when you're running virtual machines.
Right. Our source recommends at least 16 gigabytes as a starting point. But honestly, if you can swing it, 32 gigabytes can give you a much better experience.
So like double it if you can.
Yeah, pretty much. And here's another thing to consider. ECC RAM.
ECC RAM.
Yeah, ECC stands for error correcting code. It's a type of RAM that can actually detect and correct errors in memory.
Whoa, that's pretty cool.
It is. It's especially important if you're planning on using ZFS for your storage, because ZFS is really sensitive to data corruption.
Oh, I see. So ECC RAM helps keep everything running smoothly and prevents those, dreaded data loss scenarios.
Exactly. Now, the last thing on the non-negotiables list, storage. And this is like a big one.
Yeah, storage is always a hot topic in the Homelab world.
Absolutely. And our source is very clear on this. Do not even think about running Proxmox and your VMs on a spinning hard drive.
Oof. Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for frustration.
It is. You absolutely need an SSD. Or, even better, an NVMe drive if your system supports it. The performance difference is night and day.
So SSD or NVMe for the system drive for sure. What about for the VMs themselves?
Ideally, you'd want SSDs for the VMs too, but, depending on your use case and budget, you might be able to get away with using hard drives for less demanding VMs, like maybe a file server or something.
Right, that makes sense. So we've got our non-negotiables, CPU with virtualization support, plenty of RAM, preferably ECC, and an SSD or NVMe drive for the system. Got it. Now, let's talk about some actual hardware. What kind of used machines should people be looking at for their Proxmox setups?
Okay, so let's start with something small and quiet. Low-power mini PCs.
Like those little Intel NUCs?
Yeah, exactly. Things like Intel NUCs or those tiny boxes with processors like the Intel N100 or N305. They're great as you're limited on space or you're really concerned about power consumption.
Yeah, they sip power, right?
They really do. And they're usually pretty quiet too, which is a big plus if you're running your home lab in your living room or something.
But there's got to be a trade-off, right? They can't be good for everything.
You're right. The biggest limitations with mini PCs are expandability and RAM capacity. Most of them don't have PCIe slots for adding extra network cards or GPUs, and their RAM slots are often limited too.
So they're good for like basic stuff, but if you want to get really fancy with your home lab setup, they might not cut it.
Exactly. So if you think you might need to upgrade down the line or you plan on running lots of memory-intensive VMs, then you'll probably want to look at something a bit bigger.
Okay, what about something a step up from the mini PCs? What's the next category?
Next up, we have used office desktops. Things like HP ProDesks, Dell Optiplexes, the kind of computers you see in every office.
Yeah, those are everywhere.
They're super common, which means they're usually pretty affordable on the used market. And they tend to have decent specs for Proxmox.
Like, what kind of processors are we talking about here?
You'll often find them with 6th-generation Intel CPUs or newer, so, Skylake and onwards. They usually have enough cores and RAM slots to handle a decent Proxmox setup.
Okay, so not cutting edge, but still perfectly capable.
Exactly. And the nice thing about these used office desktops is that they often have some room for upgrades. You can usually add more RAM, and some of them even have a PCIe slot or two for a graphics card.
So you can tinker with them a bit. Any downsides to watch out for?
Yeah, a couple of things. Some of these business-oriented machines might have BIOS limitations that prevent you from installing certain types of hardware. So you might need to do some research to make sure the specific model you're looking at will work with the components you want to use. And also pay attention to the number of RAM slots. Some of the smaller form factor desktops might only have 2 slots, which can limit your maximum RAM capacity.
Got it. So do your homework before the buy, check the BIOS and the RAM slots. Okay, what about something even more powerful?
All right, now we're moving into the realm of older enterprise servers. Think Dell R730s, HP DL380s, Supermicro towers, the big boys.
Oh yeah, those are beasts.
They are. These servers are designed for, running massive workloads in data centers. So they often have a lot of cores, tons of RAM slots, and support for ECC RAM.
Plus, they usually come with enterprise-grade features like IPMI for remote management.
Exactly. And lots of bays for storage expansion. So if you need to run a lot of VMs or you need a massive amount of storage space, then a used enterprise server might be the way to go.
Sounds impressive, but there have to be some downsides, right?
You bet. The biggest drawbacks for home users are noise and power consumption. These servers can be loud, like really loud, and they draw a lot of power. They were designed to be in a data center with industrial-grade cooling, not in your living room.
So a hefty electricity bill and maybe some annoyed neighbors.
Pretty much. And, for most home lab use cases, a full-blown server is probably overkill. You probably don't need that many cores or that much RAM.
Okay, so not for everyone, but an option for those who need serious horsepower. What about something in between desktops and servers?
Yeah, that's where used workstations come in. And this is actually what our source recommends as a sweet spot for most people.
Workstations. Interesting. What makes them so good?
Well, they tend to strike a good balance between power and noise. They're quieter than servers, but they still have enough processing power for most home lab tasks. And their power consumption is usually more reasonable, too.
So like a happy medium.
Exactly. Think of something like a Dell Precision T3610 or similar. They often come with Xeon E3 processors, which are pretty powerful, but not as power-hungry as the bigger Xeon chips you find in servers.
Yeah, those Xeons are beasts, but they can draw a lot of power. Okay, so workstations, good to know. Now let's talk about power consumption a bit more.
Yeah, power is something that a lot of people overlook when they're building a home lab, but it can really add up over time,
Especially with older hardware, right?
especially with older servers. A server from a few years ago might idle at 150 or even 300 watts.
Wow, that's more than my refrigerator uses.
It is. And if it's running 2047, you're talking about a significant increase in your electricity bill.
So factor that into your budget, right?
Absolutely. Now, compare that to a mini PC or a newer desktop, which might only idle at 30 watts.
Yeah, that's a huge difference.
It is. So before you buy any used hardware, think about where you're going to put it and how much noise and heat you're willing to tolerate.
Right, because that silent, energy-efficient mini PC suddenly looks a lot more appealing if it means you can actually sleep at night.
Exactly. So choose your hardware wisely. Okay, now let's talk about, actually tailoring your hardware choices to your specific needs.
Yeah, this is where it gets really personal, right? What do you actually want to do with your Proxmox setup?
Exactly. And this is something that a lot of general guides tend to skip over, but it's so important because the best hardware for you depends entirely on what you're planning to run.
Like, are you just messing around with a few containers, or are you building a full-fledged virtualized environment with, multiple VMs running different services?
Right. Our source gives a great example use case, running Nextcloud, Taperless and Penix, Image, a Git server, a Matix instance, and even Onex.
Wow, that's a pretty comprehensive home lab setup.
It is. It covers a lot of bases. And for a setup like that, you're going to need some decent hardware.
Yeah, for sure. What are the minimum specs they recommend?
Well, they say you'll need at least 4 CPU cores, ideally with 8 threads, and at least 32 GB of RAM, and of course fast storage. An SSD or NVMe is a must.
And what about IOMU?
Yeah, if you want to do any hardware pass-through, like if you want to give a VM direct access to a GPU or a USB controller, then you'll need IOMU support.
So pretty much all the things we've been talking about. Virtualization support, RAM, storage, and IOMU.
Exactly. Now, in terms of specific hardware for this use case, they recommend a used workstation with a Xeon E3 or an 8th generation Intel i7.
So not necessarily a full-blown server, but something with a bit more oomph than a desktop.
Right, a workstation gives you that sweet spot of power and quiet operation.
Okay, that makes sense. Any other, like, bonus tips for people shopping for used hardware?
Oh yeah, definitely. Remember ECC RAM. It's a good idea to look for that, especially if you're planning on using ZFS.
Right, help to keep the data safe.
Exactly. And also keep an eye out for features like IPMI, iDRAC, or IOO. Those are the remote management interfaces that let you control your server, even if the operating system crashes.
Oh yeah, that's super helpful, especially if you're running a headless server.
It is. And having multiple NICs can be useful too, especially if you want to play around with virtual firewalls or VLANs.
And what about hot swap bays? Are those important?
They're not essential, but they can be really convenient if you need to add or replace drives.
Yeah, that makes sense. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners?
Yeah, don't stress about finding the absolute perfect hardware right away. You'll probably upgrade things down the line as your needs change. Just focus on getting something that meets those core requirements, and that won't become a bottleneck too quickly.
Right, so don't go for the potato, but also don't feel like you need to get the most powerful server out there.
Exactly. Find that sweet spot where you get enterprise-grade reliability and performance without the excessive power consumption and noise.
And remember, the best hardware for you is the hardware that fits your specific need.
Exactly. So after hearing all this, what kind of digital services are you now imagining you could run? What kind of home lab could you build without breaking the bank or, annoying your family with the noise?
That's the fun part, isn't it? Figuring out what's possible and then making it happen.
Absolutely. So get out there, find some awesome used hardware, and start building your dream home lab.
And share your creations with us. We'd love to see what you come up with.
Until next time, happy virtualizing.